Attention to some logistical items. First, please note that this meeting is being broadcast via webinar and is also being recorded. The recording and slides and other materials will be posted to the council's committee section on the website, which is azwater.gov/GWPC. Only members of the committee will be able to unmute themselves on the webinar to participate. And for those in person, please make sure to unmute your mic before speaking so that everyone in the room and anyone on the webinar can hear you. So the little mic in front of you, it should have a red light right now. So just hit that once, it'll turn green and you speak into that and then turn it off when you're done. And then if anyone listening in has any technical issues, please call the ADWR help desk at 602-771-8444 or email tickets@azwater.gov. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent. Again, welcome to this first meeting of the Rural Groundwater Committee. I'm Tom Bushatsky, DWR Director and Chair of the Governor's Water Policy Council. I appreciate all of you making the time in your schedules to participate and to do so in person. I would like next to do a roll call for all the committee members and or the alternates that are in attendance, both here or virtually, and I'll send it back to Trent to do that roll call.
So please just let us know if you're here or an alternate sitting in. Paul Brierly, Maria Dadgar, Ron Doba, Sandra Fabrit, Jamie Kelly. Oh, will you also please push your button when you say?
Travis Lingenfelter, President, alternate for Jamie Kelly.
Senator Sina Kerr.
Present.
Chris Kuzdas.
Present.
Sharon Magdahl.
Present.
Haley Paul.
Here.
Aaron Peters.
Here.
Sarah Porter.
Here.
Stephanie Smallhouse.
Here.
Abe Springer.
Present.
Craig Sullivan.
Present.
Tom Torres.
Russell Benford, alternate for Tom Torres, present.
Representative Stacy Travers.
Here.
And Chris Udall.
Here, and I did want to introduce my alternate, Matt Bayer, who's here from Ag West Farm Credit.
Thanks, Trent. And we have several other DWR staff in the room. Clint Chandler, Deputy Director, Carol Ward, Assistant Director, Natalie Mast, AMA Director, and John Riggins, Statewide Planning Manager, and Bruce Hallen, Advisor to Director. John and Bruce are going to largely run the meeting today. We have staff and myself available to weigh in as needed. Also want to introduce Patrick Adams is here with us, the Water Policy Advisor for Governor Hobbs. With that, I'm going to turn this show over to Bruce and John.
Thank you, Director Bushatsky, and let me reiterate the thank you to all of you for participating in today's meeting. Today's agenda, as Director Bushatsky mentioned, will be more of a team presentation. I will cover the committee goals, objectives, and the process. I'll then pass the microphone to the co-chair of the committee, who is John Riggins, and John will provide an overview of the rural groundwater issue and provide some further context on the extent of the problem we are tasked here to address. John's presentation will reacquaint the committee on the groundwater challenges facing rural Arizona including identifying the unique circumstances that exist within each basin. I'll then address moving forward, the committee timeline and next steps. And at that point, before closing remarks, we'll also request committee input and any committee concepts that they may want to share. As part of the moving forward component, I'll provide an overview, as you all are very aware, on the significant amount of discussions and proposals, including draft legislation that have been made over the past few years on addressing the rural groundwater management issue. We have drafted a starting point proposal as a means to immediately begin discussions and discussing concepts to respond to the groundwater problems. Our timeline is very short, December 2023, but we do have the advantage of past efforts to ensure we provide the governor effective concepts and recommendations that are reflective of the unique circumstances that exist within the groundwater basins here in rural Arizona. Next slide, please. We'll now cover the goals of the committee, why we're here to do all this important work, and I'll also touch upon the process. Next slide, please. This committee is tasked to expeditiously address the serious challenges caused by groundwater overdraft, falling groundwater levels in rural Arizona. You all are here because the state has identified you as the key experts needed to collaborate and identify solutions that safeguard against groundwater overuse and ensure there are sufficient groundwater supplies for current and future generations. It's imperative that this committee identify groundwater management strategies that can be modified and adapted to the specific conditions and needs of each groundwater basin. Such strategies will protect citizens, strengthen rural economies, provide water security and sustainable supplies. So if you look at this goal that we have listed here, by December 2023, we're posed with developing policy, legislative, or other actionable recommendations for the governor that provide a groundwater management framework that assists rural communities to manage local groundwater resources, protect water users, and sustainably manage aquifers. These recommendations will assist rural communities outside the AMAs and the INAs in managing local groundwater resources and mitigating further aquifer depletion. These recommendations should be broad enough to address the specific groundwater basin's management needs and tailored to the basin's unique characteristics. So as we move forward in developing recommendations, we're going to use this as a platform that we want to ensure that we follow. Next slide, please. These are a list of rural groundwater changes. As you know, many of these communities lack access to alternative water supplies, and some are even exclusively dependent on groundwater. For that reason, it's crucial that there be some form of groundwater management in place to ensure that groundwater use is sustainable to safeguard the health, safety, and economic welfare of the public. If you look at this list of challenges, many of these I view almost as principles, but I'll go ahead and go through each one. Number one, groundwater basins across Arizona are experiencing high rates of aquifer depletion. These basins lack access to an alternative water supply, and most basins rely solely on groundwater. There are a lack of management programs or regulatory framework to sustainably manage groundwater outside the AMAs and INAs. Due to the lack of groundwater management options available, rural communities are vulnerable to losing access to vital groundwater supplies. And then each groundwater basin possesses unique variables that influence the impact of groundwater overuse and aquifer depletion. Next slide, please. Here's the committee process that we intend to follow, and this is very similar to the other committee, the Assured Water Supply Committee. Committee members will be council members or their designated representatives. Designees are empowered to make decisions and are responsible for briefing their respective council members. Committees may form technical subcommittees, and we'll talk a bit about that today as necessary to accomplish tasks. Subcommittees will serve as informal work groups. So that's where most of the work's going to get done. That may include proxies with technical expertise and perspectives. Subcommittees may invite stakeholders. And I know many of you have been actively involved on this issue, and there are many stakeholders that have provided you input, and I think that's going to be critical in moving forward, that we continue to receive that stakeholder input. But subcommittees may invite stakeholders to participate and share their insight and perspective. Subcommittees will report back to the committee, and to keep the process nimble, ensure continuity of discussion, and enable progress and outcomes, we'd like to keep the committees and subcommittees as small as possible. Next slide, please. Committee meetings will be open to the public, but participation will be limited to committee members. Council members will represent their respective communities. Committee meetings will be recorded. Recordings and meeting materials will be posted to the webpage. Meetings will be working meetings. So we plan on working to have discussion and arrive at decisions. Agendas and materials will be provided as much in advance as possible. And a subcommittee or committee does not require unanimity to move something forward. If there are concerns with proposals, they will be noted and documented. Next slide. As I mentioned previously, the committee is tasked to provide proposals to the council for consideration in December 2023. So the process will move very, very quickly. The committee will meet at least once a month, and we'll talk about that today, for 2 hours from June through December or more as necessary. Tentative dates and times have been set to reserve meeting space and enable the process. Adjustments may be made. Additional committee and subcommittee meetings will be scheduled as needed, and committee members are encouraged to attend meetings in person because these are planned to be working meetings, but a virtual option may be available. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn the microphone now over to John, and John Riggins will now be giving us kind of a background and overview of the groundwater situation in rural Arizona.
Thank you, Bruce. Can everybody hear me? Is that? All right, is that better? Okay. All right, well, thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon. So as Bruce mentioned, I'll be giving a brief overview of groundwater challenges facing rural Arizona, and we'll focus on the impact of groundwater pumping in rural communities outside of the state's AMAs. I guess I'm the next slide. We'll do that. So outside the state's active management areas and irrigation non-expansion areas, AMAs and INAs, there's limited regulatory framework for managing groundwater. These limitations include no requirements for metering and reporting non-exempt wells. And those are wells that pump quantities of groundwater over 35 gallons per minute. Yet some areas of rural Arizona are experiencing an increase in their groundwater use. Many communities are facing aquifer depletion with limited access to renewable supplies and limited options to manage declining groundwater, resulting in growing calls for a framework that will assist rural communities to manage their groundwater resources. So today I'll provide an overview of the impact that significant groundwater overdraft is having in rural Arizona and highlight a few areas that have limited regulatory framework for managing groundwater use. So here we see a familiar slide. This is the statewide groundwater use, which shows the groundwater use for the state is 41% of the state's total water supply. Some areas of the state benefit from having access to additional sources of water, such as CAP and surface water. But many groundwater basins in rural Arizona outside of the state's AMAs rely on groundwater as their primary source. And another familiar slide, the statewide water use by sector. So here we see a breakdown of the state's water use by water use sector. Municipal use is about 22%, industrial use 6%, and agricultural use 72%. Again, that's statewide total water use by sector. So really, rather than focus on any specific area today, I'd like to provide a little bit more of a high-level statewide overview, and then I'll touch on a few specific areas with high rates of decline. So this will be a broad overview, groundwater wells and pumping capacity for areas outside of the managed areas in the state. The map on the left shows our ADWR groundwater well registry. And that includes all groundwater wells that are registered with the state and with ADWR. Of the groundwater wells registered with ADWR, approximately 175,000 are withdrawing groundwater. Of those, nearly 100,000 are outside the state's AMAs and INAs, with 78,000 of those being exempt wells. So those are wells that are smaller, domestic-sized wells that are pumping less than 35 gallons per minute. And there are over 37,000 non-exempt wells, meaning they pump more than 35 gallons per minute. Wells that have the pumping capacity greater than 35 gallons per minute, or non-exempt wells, account for approximately 22,000 wells outside of the state's AMAs and INAs. As you see from this graph, these non-exempt wells outside the state's AMAs and INAs account for only 13% of the state's groundwater wells withdrawing water. Exempt wells outside the AMAs, typically your domestic household wells, make up 46% of the state's groundwater wells withdrawing water. So this graph demonstrates where the greatest groundwater pumping capacity resides in Arizona. This is a pumping capacity based on the registered well information, and it does not reflect the actual annual volumes of water pumped. Since we don't have metering and reporting requirements outside of the state's AMAs and INAs, we don't have a clear picture on what the statewide volume of groundwater pumped outside the AMAs and INAs would be. As we saw on the last slide, non-exempt wells, those are wells that pump greater than 35 gallons per minute, account for 13% of registered wells outside of its AMAs. Those 13% of wells account for nearly half the total pumping capacity for areas outside the AMAs, or 47% that you see on the screen in gray. While the 46% of domestic well owners account for only 3% of the pumping capacity that we see on the screen in yellow. As we saw in the last graph, though there are more registered exempt wells like domestic wells, the overwhelming majority of pumping capacity, not pumping volume, pumping capacity is by large non-exempt wells. The map on the left shows the 51 groundwater basins in Arizona, and it includes highlighted the state's AMAs and INAs, shown in yellow and pink. The map on the right is from our ADWR statewide water level open file report, which we published last April. It illustrates the groundwater level declines observed by ADWR across the state using our groundwater site inventory wells, index wells, and transducer well sites to gather data. This map captures the observed water level for a period of 20 years from 2000 to 2020. And you can see the red dots concentrated in the groundwater basins that indicate an observed groundwater decline in those areas. So as I mentioned earlier, this presentation is more of a statewide overview, but I would like to provide and show a few examples of groundwater basins outside the state's AMAs that have limited groundwater regulations or metering and reporting. Here we see the Gila Bend Basin and a portion of the lower Gila groundwater basin. These basins do not have requirements for metering or reporting to the state. So we don't have the specific groundwater use data other than the water use estimates provided by organizations such as the USGS through joint funding agreements with the state. The map on the right shows the Gila Bend Basin and a large subsidence feature shown in yellow. New agriculture in the Hyder area, which is in the lower Gila Basin, as well as agriculture and various industrial uses in the Gila Bend Basin, add to the overall groundwater use in the region. Groundwater concerns and challenges are not exclusively observed in the basin and range groundwater basins. We've received numerous concerns from residents in the Agua Fria groundwater basin, especially in the area around Black Canyon City and Cortez Lakes. There are reports of declining water levels and concerns for domestic wells. We've heard concerns from residents in Yavapai County, the Verde Valley. We've also heard from stakeholders in and around the Flagstaff area and along the Colorado Plateau. Again, these basins are outside the regulatory requirements of the state's AMAs and INAs, and they do not meter or report groundwater to the department. Therefore, we only have estimated water uses for those areas. Here we see a map. The map on the left is of a very large subsidence area in the northern portion of Wilcox Basin. This is a high subsidence region, and it is so the water levels have steadily declined there since the 1950s, with groundwater levels having declined by 200 to 300 feet pre-development levels in some of the major pumping areas. Here we see another subsidence feature in Wilcox Basin. This is the southern portion, and this shows the subsidence region with a significant subsidence region located along the eastern portion of the Wilcox Playa in the Kansas Settlement region. We also see a well pad and wellhead protruding above the surface from subsidence in that area. So now I will cover quickly some of the newly designated AMA active management area and established irrigation non-expansion area, the Douglas AMA and Wallapai Valley INA. On August 30th, 2022, in response to a petition that was filed by residents pursuant to statute, the Board of Supervisors of Cochise County called for an election to be held on November 8th, 2022, on whether to designate the Douglas Groundwater Basin as a subsequent AMA. The AMA was designated on December 1st, 2022. For Wallapai, on November 12th, 2022, the department held a public hearing to present the factual data in its possession in support of of opposition to proposed subsequent irrigation non-expansion area pursuant to statute. Here we see the portion of the Douglas AMA. The map on the right is another subsidence feature for the basin as a whole, and you see the figures there for the outflows and inflows into the basin. Groundwater levels declined over 200 feet, have been observed since 1965, and land subsidence, which you see in the graphic on the right there, has also been observed. Here you see a map of the basin map, groundwater basin for the Wallapai Valley INA. Based on the findings that are shown on the screen, the director designated the Wallapai Valley Groundwater Basin as an INA on December 19th, 2022. And with that, I will hand the meeting back over to Bruce.
Thank you, John. If we could we please advance this slide? As we mentioned earlier, we don't have a lot of time. The community does not have a lot of time in developing these recommendations to the governor. Our objective today is to begin work immediately. As you are aware, there have been several past efforts over the past few years that have identified a variety of management schemes and programs to address the rural groundwater challenges. A wide variety of stakeholders throughout the state have been involved in these discussions and in developing responses to managing groundwater supplies. This really provides us a head start in responding to the governor's request for actionable recommendations to address the unsustainable depletion of groundwater in many of Arizona's rural groundwater basins. If you look at the top, the history of proposed groundwater management concepts for rural Arizona over the last 10 years, we have groundwater conservation areas that have been proposed, rural management areas, and local groundwater stewardship areas. So there are many management options and programs that were proposed in those programs that we can utilize to help develop recommendations to the governor, since much of this has been discussed with stakeholders and others. But there are other options and management options that are available to the state and as possible recommendations to the governor from the committee, including the director having the authority to create either AMAs or INAs. John mentioned 2 examples today between the Douglas AMA and Hualapai INA. But there are situations today in a few other groundwater basins that very well could warrant the director moving forward to establish an INA or an AMA. Next slide, please. What we thought we would do here is this is really a program concept matrix. If you look at the x-axis, it just lists a variety of management tools. And on the y-axis, it includes either existing or proposed concepts and whether those existing or proposed concepts included these management tools. These programs, again, provide the committee a variety of management tools and concepts to consider in drafting the recommendations to the governor. I do want to point out though, that the proposed programs were not necessarily supported or endorsed by DWR. Next slide, please. This is a continuation of that previous matrix. I would also like to point out there are many similarities between each of the programs as you look at the X's and what each of these programs proposed. Many stakeholders and organizations have been involved in the drafting of these concepts, which means there's a lot of familiarity on options for the committee to consider. Next slide. So with that, and with the amount of information that's been available to the committee associated with rural groundwater management programs, what we're proposing is that we'd like to form a rural groundwater subcommittee. A rural groundwater subcommittee formed immediately or more of a working group to begin the task of developing the recommendations to the governor. In advance, ADWR took the liberty to draft a starting point proposal from which the committee to work from. Highlights of the proposal include the goal, customizable by area with local input, prevent long-term declines in groundwater levels, limits on depth to groundwater and rate of depletion. The requirements. As we go through these requirements, as you all, there will be several nuances associated with these requirements. So we didn't go into a lot of detail associated with that, really leave that up to the committee as part of discussions. And again, this is but a starting point proposal to begin us to immediately begin working on what the recommendations will be to the governor. Requirements include groundwater monitoring, metering, and reporting to track goal progress, limits on new wells that will impact the ability to meet the goal, but then require maybe a potential mitigation program associated with that. Non-expansion of largest users of groundwater potentially. Incent, encourage supply mitigation options, recharge, reuse, rainwater capture, mandatory conservation requirements, local input, ADWR approval and enforcement authority, and then lastly, customizable for unique situations in each basin are based on geographic, geohydrologic, climatic, economic, ecological, and end water user conditions. Because as you all are familiar with in this state, there are very unique situations that exist throughout the state when it comes to each of these basins. We want to use this as a mechanism to initiate discussion, get the subcommittee to build upon what we have created in this proposal and immediately start assembling the recommended proposal with requirements. Before we leave today, please let us know if you're interested in serving on this subcommittee. If you're unsure whether you have the time to serve on the working group subcommittee, please let us know by July 6th if you are available, or if you have a proxy or stakeholder that you would like to participate in this group. Remember, these will be working group meetings, not public meetings. Next slide, please. The Rural Groundwater Subcommittee role. First items, begin evaluating this starting point proposal. Next item for this subcommittee is to identify and consider other groundwater regulatory policy management programs previously proposed. Build a recommended approach. Recommendations must address the groundwater committee goals and objectives, those items that we outlined up front. Consider recommendation variations due to unique conditions for each basin, and then present to the committee for discussion recommendations from this subcommittee. We've provided a lot of information and covered a lot of data and in addition to that, provided a direction for the community. So what we'd like to do now, if I could have the next slide, is really hear from you all, the committee, regarding what has been proposed and potentially any concepts or programs you would like to share. Yes, Stephanie.
So could you go back like 2 slides on the proposal? Right there. So just for clarification, are the requirements, is what we recommend have to have some iteration of those requirements? Or are those the requirements that are being proposed, if that makes sense?
This is just a starting proposal. This is something that we thought that the committee and the subcommittee members could respond to. There have been no decisions yet on what exactly is part of the proposal, but these are suggestions that we've gathered essentially from reviewing past efforts where there are very, very similar requirements associated with what these requirements are. Ron.
Thanks, Bruce. Just a question on this starting point proposal. I don't see anything in there as far as how something like this would be put in place or initiated. Has that been given any thought, or is that going to be left up to the subcommittee to make a recommendation?
That will be left up to the subcommittee for
Okay.
Representative Travers.
Thank you very much. To that point, something that I would like to see from some of these recommendations is how do we approach this holistically? And the way that I kind of describe it is a short-term, medium-term, and a long-term fix on these. So as a subcommittee or as a committee, what can be done sort of in the most immediate way, whether that's through executive action or through something else. Medium term is what do we task ADWR with doing that they have within their authority and their purview to do, knowing that they've got the backing of the council. And then thirdly, which is the sort of long-term approach, is what can we do legislatively? Because we've seen historically that even though we might want to do something to advance the cause, for example, HB 2731, it won't get a hearing. And so knowing that right now, how do we take these suggestions, whether they're on here or whether they're something that has been constructed through the subcommittee, how do we create the approach to make sure that we can implement these in the most efficient way and have it done? So I would like us all to be able to consider that as well. These are great ideas, but how do we get them done without kind of not getting it done?
Thank you. Abe.
Yeah, this is probably a question for John. That last bullet has a lot in it. And I was wondering if the agency's ever done a technical evaluation of those unique situations from some of your current supply and demand evaluations or other studies. Otherwise, it seems like a lot of heavy lifting for a technical subcommittee.
That's a good question and a fair question. I think there has been already a lot of work done, especially in some of these basins that we've identified where there are challenges and issues right now currently. Certainly with the supply and demand assessment, we're into the first year of the assessment right now, and we'll be complete with the first year in December. But as that goes and continues and progresses over time, that data will be able to be applied to efforts like this. But currently at this moment, the supply and demand assessment wouldn't necessarily, with the timeline that we'll have for addressing this proposal and requirements, probably will be something to be addressed later on.
I'll add, Abe, that perhaps some of this information or much of this information can come from the local areas themselves and the constituents who reside there and are very familiar with the conditions on the ground that are described here. We don't have accurate data for most of these basins, as we've talked about quite a bit. And we don't have groundwater models for most of our basins, only kind of those within the AMAs and a couple more for areas that had been considered as INAs or AMAs in the past. So I think we're going to have to rely in the near term for feedback from those folks to get some of this information and their input.
Sandy.
I guess, are you asking the committee subcommittee to look at it? We're not looking specifically basin by basin, but more generally based on basin and range, transition plateau type thing. And that's where those conditions would be, there would be variables based on those characteristics.
We're asking both.
Yeah, thank you so much, sir. Do we know, given what you've just said, that, we kind of know what we don't know? We know that, that the Wilcox Basin is right now the most critical. Do we have an idea of that other list that you presented of kind of what's going to be the next critical ones or where we're at?
Would you like to answer that, John?
Well, he's fiddling. I'll say Wilcox Basin is one area where we do have a model. We have a little bit of a leg up for that particular basin representative.
And maybe that's something too, as far as prioritizing, and I don't know if that's the right term, but maybe that's something for the subcommittee to have discussions on.
Okay, because I'm assuming some of the decisions that we make on whether we recommend an AMA or an INA or, whatever it is, whatever construct we think is going to help mitigate the situation would be based on those sort of external circumstances. Is that correct? Yeah.
Ron.
I just want to note that, some of the things that we've been looking at in the past, like the local groundwater stewardship area bill and so forth, did have the flexibility in it so that boundaries could be formed for a specific area based on, hydrologic analysis, because some of the basins that we have in the state, like the Little Colorado River Basin, is so huge. It covers a lot of area, and there may be much smaller areas that need groundwater management, some sort of a tool put in place. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be a complete basin.
Thanks for that, Ron. And those are all elements that we're going to need to discuss with this working group subcommittee.
And Ron, I'll add maybe an analysis of those against the AMA and INA requirements where they sometimes lack in the ability to address those smaller areas.
Sharon.
Yeah, just along the lines of what information the department has on these different basins, do you kind of have an inventory, or could you prepare an inventory that could be helpful to the subcommittee to know, okay, this is what we know, and just have that available?
I think we'd be able to pull something together with through our hydrology, through our reports, to put something together. Would you be thinking of something, a high-level overview of the basins, kind of where the areas of concern are, the rates of decline?
To the extent you could, but also if you could refer people to, okay, here's this report on this basin. Not everybody is fluent in what modeling you've done and what is available. So I'm just saying anything that you could provide that would help people understand what is known. Not that if you provide something too long and deep, people aren't going to read it, but to kind of provide an overview.
Sarah.
Thanks. I have a comment and a question, and that is that the Kyle Center has put the department's statewide groundwater level changes report on a data visualization available on the Arizona Water Blueprint Groundwater Level Changes app. And there's a huge amount of data that we've just taken from a report and moved to a visualization format. So that might be a place to start to see what's going on with different basins. And one of the things that I always note when I look at that map is while the department is doing its best with its monitoring data from USGS and the department, there are a lot of basins that probably don't have enough monitoring, there aren't enough wells to probably get a really clear picture. I've wondered if the department has explored using GRACE data or other types of methodologies available for getting a bigger picture of what's going on in different subbasins.
Hey there. So for the folks here who don't know, my name's Ryan Mitchell. I'm the chief hydrologist. And one of the problems that we've been having is that our index wells, the line of index wells has been reducing year after year because they're voluntary. And so a lot of the data we have is more dense in history, less dense as we move forward. So any sources of data that we do have or anyone else has, we will use in our water level change map series and open file reports. So yeah, the availability of groundwater data is one of the biggest hurdles. As far as density, yeah, and as most people know, where your data is and where your well is screened is just as important as how much of it you have. So some areas we have a lot of data, some areas are completely blank, we have nothing. And so we have to interpolate in between those points. Part of what I hope to see come out of this committee is a bit of a change in the paradigm with the public of sharing data with us, right? We're not the enemy. We're trying to help monitor, regulate, and fix and address problems. And part of that is access to data. So there are definitely basins where we have a lot of data density. There are definitely basins where we have almost nothing. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I wonder if coupling what the department has with, for example, GRACE data, and I think ASU would be very happy to work with you. We have Jay Family-Yeti, one of the pioneers of that type of groundwater monitoring, could help communities understand how their well data, could make a difference.
Right. It's kind of like the story map stuff that you guys are doing, where you're taking something that's academically dense, like data and hydrology and all that stuff, but making it consumable to the public, right? So everything that you guys are doing is great for that. It's letting people have access to all that data and being able to hopefully interpret it. But we are more than happy to work with you. I am.
And I was just going to follow up, Sharon, and also offer help as the regents are supporting the 3 universities for our statewide recharge enhancement project right now. One of the parts of that project is we're evaluating every USGS stream gauge in the state for its contribution to groundwater discharge to the stream flow. And to answer your question, Sarah, there are 16 groundwater basins which do not have a USGS stream flow gauge in them.
As are they used to.
Yeah.
A lot of them have been taken down due to funding and over the years, right? So
Yeah.
we try where we can. When they come to us and say, can you help cost sharing? We'll always do it because for me, there's no such thing as too much data.
As soon as my student prepares the data, I'll be able to share it with the committee. We'll have a statewide assessment of the groundwater contribution to our streams of the state in progress this fall. We're happy to share that as well. That's great.
Chris.
Just a quick question. I may have missed this, but The time frame is this monthly or as often as necessary? Was that what was brought up?
We'll talk about that in the next piece of the presentation, but I'm thinking it will be as necessary because there's a lot here to cover, especially for the subcommittee. Or for the committee, right now we have it proposed as a monthly.
And then on the committee, I expect that is a collaborative effort of the various sectors, ag, municipal, industrial, environmental, all working together in that committee.
Yes, well, I believe that we've asked you to bring stakeholders that all have an interest in those
But
areas
I-
as water users. Yes.
didn't know if you'd be breaking those up to talk about issues separately and then bringing them together.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I had a more specific question about the index wells that was mentioned. So what does that mean when an index well is no longer providing data? What does that mean?
The vast majority of the time, it's either destroyed, so urbanized and paved over, the well's gone, or land ownership has occurred and the new owners don't want us coming to their property and collecting water levels. So index wells are just is a phrase or a term for the wells that we regularly monitor. Some of them are monthly, some of them are quarterly, some are annual. They are the ones that we always get every time. So when you go to the groundwater site inventory, the GWSI web map, that's the data that those guys are collecting. And getting people to voluntarily join the index books and the index lines is like pulling teeth sometimes. So if you guys have contacts and have influence over locals in rural areas that want to enroll their wells in this program, just let me know. We'll get them put into the rotation.
So just as a follow-up, so the people who have voluntarily been involved in the index well process, it's not that they're leaving, it's that ownership is changing.
Right. Most of the wells, not all, but most are privately owned. And so the wells themselves were initially put into the index line by the USGS in the 70s. And a lot of them are old, but when wells do come on and people are putting in new wells and we know who they are and they know who we are, they'll volunteer to let us come and collect those. So we have some other stakeholders like large industry or mining folks or whoever who want us to come and do that and monitor for them as well. But we can do it for anybody. We have access agreements in place with a lot of locals. So like I said, if you have any suggestions, let me know.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have an opportunity on our website for people to submit their their water level information to us as well. That's a relatively new thing over 5 or 6 years ago. And we always make sure that we label that so folks know where that data came from versus us going out and collecting it.
Yeah, and that's a good clarification. So if a well is in GWSI and it's one of our index wells, that means that we've surveyed it ourselves. And the guys who collect the data have it thoroughly QA'd and QC'd before it's published. In other words, it's well vetted. Anyone who goes through the third-party water level portal, we would usually try to verify that data before we put it onto our publicly available website. But you can self-report. But with it being self-reporting and being water and being in a state where water is sensitive, we like to verify, right? So that's where the index books are great because we know that it's our guys collecting it. We have survey data. We know exactly what the water level is. There's a lot of checks in place there. So the third-party portal is excellent for providing additional information, but it has less weight when modeling, for example. We'll default to ours.
Representative Travers. Okay, you can wait. Paul?
Obviously, one of the concerns people would have is how will that data be used? So I'm just kind of curious what kind of guardrails there are, what you tell them it's used for and what kind of guardrails there are to make sure that's all it's used for.
I'll just stand here for a bit, sorry. So anything that is in the GWSI index line will be publicly available, usually within a few weeks of when it's collected. And the reason for that is because the database, the data set is living, it's live. And so we want to make sure that it's constantly being updated. So we make that clear when adding people into the index line. But all that we are doing is just grabbing the date and the depth of water. That's all that goes into the GWSI stuff. Other folks, private industry plus us in our modeling group, we will then use those data to develop water level change maps, to develop models, to calibrate models. So how the data is used later is all purely scientific, right? What people are afraid of is like, I don't want you to take away my water, and we're not taking away anything. We just want to measure it so that we have data points.
Other questions? Chris?
Yeah, thanks. I want to say that it's clear a lot of thought and work went into this in a fairly short amount of time. So want to acknowledge DWR staff for that. And I also wanted to point out the 3 proposals that you all put up there from the past. So the groundwater conservation area proposal, rural management area proposal, and then more recently this year, the local groundwater management area proposal. I think it's important to keep in mind the fact that these proposals came from rural communities that were seeking help and solutions from the legislature. And one of the things these proposals all share in common is they weren't given a hearing. And so with that pattern in mind, I think keeping all options on the table, including executive action, to support communities that are seeking help and solutions and have been for years is really important. So I wanted to raise that point and that recent history.
Travis Lingenfelter, alternate for Jamie Kelly, yes. First of all, I just want to thank the governor's office and ADWR for having this process. As chairman of the Mojave County Board of Supervisors, I've worked very closely with the supervisors, my colleagues in Coconino County, in Yavapai County, in La Paz County. Collectively, we represent over 625,000 rural Arizonans. And I want to tell you that we have your back. We support you with this effort, and I'm very happy to hear from Representative Travers' comments that you're serious about, in the absence of legislative action, that you're going to be looking at executive and administrative action on those basins that are already perhaps candidates for either AMA or INA. It would be wonderful in the rural areas to have a third option, a much more flexible option. I think that's in everybody's best interest, but in the lack of that, it's wonderful to hear that there's some seriousness behind taking action next year. Thank you.
Thank you. So I have some different bullet points. Let me change my glasses here so I can see what the hell I'm doing. Number one, is it beyond the purview or the scope of this council to go back to what the gentleman said, I'm sorry, I can't remember your name. Can we look at ways to try to incentivize in some way people to report? Is that something that we should leave to you guys? Is it something that maybe we should think about, or are we getting into the nuts? Is that our job to just get into the nuts and bolts of things, or how do we, and then the other thing, just kind of writ large, how do we start to create a new narrative that, the data won't be used for anything nefarious, although I'm not really sure what a nefarious use would be of having this, this information. But how do we start to change the culture that, what we're doing is good? We don't want to take away your water. We don't want to kill your industry. We just need to know so that we as a state don't kill our industries and our water supply. And I don't mean to sound so, chicken little, but we've done, we always go rest on our laurels from the 80s on what a great job that we've done with the Groundwater Management Act. And that was because we had those hard decisions and we had those hard conversations. And we've gotten to the point where we can say, look what we've done. And now we need to continue on that mitigation with, what can we do now to expand the conservation efforts that we're doing and the things that we're looking at to try to make sure that we can go forward. Because, a lot of times, a lot of what's looked at is Maricopa County. And, we see what happened with Rio Verde. And everything can't be a right now legislative fix. We need to start thinking long term. And even though maybe some of the rural areas don't have a problem, therefore, by the grace of God, go I, and you just don't know what's coming down the pike. And so, so is that something else that, I guess my question, my very long-winded question is, how do we incentivize new owners, or how do we get people to start reporting without fear, et cetera, et cetera?
So Representative, just a thought off the top of my head in response. We have the Water Supply Development Fund in WIFA. We have the Conservation Fund in WIFA. Those are a couple of things that I could think of that could help incentivize folks, because my understanding of where those funds are and what you would need to do to apply to them, you're pretty much going to have to show that information to get access to that money. So maybe those things can help change the narrative that there is some value other than the fear of regulation, right? Or the fear of taxation, or whatever the fears are. We've been kind of talking about this monitoring, meeting, and reporting issue for the 8 years that I've been the director. And we haven't figured out a good way to change the narrative and get people to embrace the value that it can create for them. And those funding sources that have not been available to us in the past and have only recently become available, maybe we can help leverage those to achieve what you suggested.
Senator Kerr.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation, the information provided to date. I feel a little bit like the elephant in the room. Speaking of, the past efforts not getting hearings and such. So I wanted to speak a little bit to that because they didn't get a hearing just because we didn't want to give it a hearing. Yes, there was stakeholder meetings and a lot of work put into those, no doubt. That doesn't mean there was overall agreement on it, assuredly. Several reasons. I'm not going to go into all of them, but one of the basic tenets of the Groundwater Management Act was that we have a centralized management in the director for Arizona's water. And I think that speaks to the great success of our management through all these years since its implementation. We're seeing current statute work as was presented. We see a new INA designation declared in the Wallapai Basin based on current statute. We see a new AMA voted on by the people down in Wilcox based on current statute. And so we see that we have those statutes that work, that involve the water users, that are a vote of the people, and those are all great things. And I think also that it provides for that local input. Once an AMA is declared in an area, then there's a Groundwater Users Advisory Council of local people there. So there's a lot of good things. Can more be done? Maybe so. I prefer an intermediate option, because right now it's all or nothing. And I like something that was also proposed. That would be an intermediate option. We do a lot of great things for groundwater management. And I think sometimes the narrative can get out there that we're not doing anything. And there's a lot that local communities have done and can do for groundwater management. So I look forward to being part of the greater discussion and, again, thankful for the work that this committee is going to do.
So thanks, Senator Kern. I'll just say, I think where we're trying to go, as you described it, as something intermediary. It's just different language. I think that's the place we're trying to go, right? To put something together that has a broad applicability, but over time can be morphed into something that meets the more local nature of the problem. And I think the limitations of the AMA and INA probably are best maybe described by the fact that in the Wallapai Basin, the INA decision is being challenged in court. And in the Douglas AMA at yesterday's hearing on the goal, there is a lot of unhappiness and a lot of different views on what the goal should be, views that perhaps can't be melded into one goal. So if we come up with kind of the intermediary idea that you talked about through this process, I think we can make this more viable and more supportable by larger groups of folks.
Good. I think largely as well, it appears, conversation always seems to center around INAs, irrigation, non-expansion, and there's only one industry that irrigates. And so I think, bringing some fairness to the equation is important. There's a lot of different industries that use a lot of water as well that are often not contemplated. And so I want to bring that to the conversation as well.
Thank you, Senator. Sharon.
Yeah, if I could just build upon Senator Kerr's comment there, I made a note to myself about at the early part of the presentation where the focus was on AMA/INAs together. And in my view, INAs are very limited things. And you have reporting, but that's pretty much it. And so I guess I would endorse this idea of not focusing on INAs in the same light as AMAs and just do a little bit more iterating on the possibilities, because INAs are very, very limited in what they require. And to me, it's not, other than you can't have more agriculture, it's not groundwater management at all. Yes, you require reporting. So I'd just like to kind of endorse some of this discussion.
Representative Travers.
To the point that somebody made, but I can't remember, is the goal of the council in getting things done unanimity? If we all have to agree on something, then possibly nothing will get done.
No, it's
So how do we, am I out of turn? Were you going to get to that? Or is it a good point to ask, what's the plan?
the plan is to develop recommendations
Plan.
to the governor. And ultimately, it'll be the department that will bring those recommendations forward. Stephanie.
So a big part of this conversation is going to have to be at some point after, if you're able to come to some ideas based on what's up here on the screen, a big part of that conversation has to be, I don't know if that's what's meant by the supply mitigation options or augmentation. Is this subcommittee going to be tasked with having conversations about that particular part of this equation in terms of augmenting water supplies, or is that going to be discussed by some other group? That's a big discussion.
That would be a big discussion, but I think those are some of the elements that we can include as part of this discussion when it comes to strategies and moving forward, if there are opportunities. Now, again, as we mentioned, you have short-term, long-term, and medium-term. And as we go through that analysis, some of these items still might need some additional study, some additional review, et cetera. So I don't want you to get too hung up on these requirements. This is just a spot to work from, a spot for us to begin developing what we think are the best requirements that we can do and that we can recommend to the governor. Other questions? Sandy.
Just trying to think through, how to get to an end result for that large of a, that's a lot of basins, a lot of, different options available. I like the concept of, short-term, medium-term, long-term. And, in my mind, monitoring and reporting's, always been a red herring. It's not our issue. It's never going to be our issue, but, just speak a little closer to the microphone. So looking at things like, just taking that, for example, is there an interim solution that there's voluntary monitoring and reporting could be a component where we're physically really filling out an annual report. You're volunteering to do it. You're providing the pumping data, the use data. I think it'll clear the air a bit too on some of the misconceptions that certain industries use a lot of water. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I mean, I'm just trying to find a path forward through some of the more long-term, red herrings in the conversation.
Sandy, I think these are conversations that we're going to have in the subcommittee. Yeah. What makes sense, what doesn't, what's doable, short, long term. Yes. Go ahead, Patrick.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you all for participating today. I just want to chime in with some observations on what I'm hearing, because I'm hearing a lot, I think, that is compatible. With Senator Kerr's points, hearing that support for centralized approach to water management, support for our statutes that are working today and the department's role in groundwater regulation, and also hearing support for local input. Those two things can work together. Bruce, can you go back to the straw man slide? We had a lot of talk about data collection and going basin by basin, but I think we should, the way I read this, Bruce, is that we should seek to find a tool that is customizable, not seek to find custom recommendations from this committee. So finding a framework that is customizable, that recognizes the varying geographies and needs across Arizona, I think that's one way to read this starting point proposal. The idea of a intermediary approach, some of the other ideas we've seen in the past have had off-ramps and time limits and things like that. So those are all things we should consider. So to Sandy's point about a short-term voluntary data collection and Sarah's offer of other venues for assessing groundwater conditions, those are all things this committee can look at as well. But I think what we want to do is find a groundwater management framework that combines some of these key components that we're hearing from the committee today. A framework that doesn't just focus on one sector, but is applicable across other sectors, right? So I'm seeing that in this list, and I'm hearing that from the committee members today. So I think we want to steer the direction in bringing these parts together into a unified structure that can work to John's part of the presentation earlier, where we know there are areas in Arizona today where we have groundwater problems that need to be addressed.
Thank you, Patrick. Any other questions? Yes.
Just one comment, specifically on the Wallapai Valley INA, which was the first INA in 40 years. At the time, and it was the third attempt to create an INA. At the time that it was created, we're stuck with 34,000 acre foot of water deficit every year. So it kicks the problem down the road. And there's nothing in state law right now that's going to help a rural community or a rural county that has no other water supply that depends solely upon a basin to solve that problem. And what I want to ask is, you mentioned the WIFA funds. Our read of the WIFA language was that unless you can prove that you have some sort of long-term sustainable supply, you may not be eligible to apply for those funds to get recharge projects or whatever you're going to do. So if you don't have an INA or you don't have some sort of protection in place, you may not be eligible for those funds as a rural community. Is that accurate?
Supervisor Lingenfelter, we'll have to look to make sure, I think in the criteria in that WIFA statute, it's something that the WIFA board needs to look at, but I don't know that it's a yes or no requirement. We'll take a second look at that because my memory is fading.
Yes, Senator Kerr.
Thank you. So I want to commend the members from Mojave County who brought forth that project for a recharge basin. And so, those types of projects are very popular and supported uh, uh, in a bipartisan way at the Capitol. And when there are general funds available, you know, if a project like that isn't able to be funded through with or whatever, you know, general funds when available are always, that's always seen as a very prudent use of taxpayer dollar and such a benefit to the basin. And I would love to see more and more all around the state.
Comments, questions? Go ahead and move on to the timeline. Committee timeline and next steps. Next slide, please. This is a general timeline for the committee. Today's meeting, late June, educate community on situational analysis. Talked about the problem statement. We've talked about priority areas. In July, subcommittee reviews and provides input on the starting proposal, considers other programs, requirements, begin drafting subcommittee proposal, meet with stakeholders, and discuss with the committee. For July, the suggestion is that we not have, and I'll bring that up in next steps, that we not have a committee meeting because the next committee meeting was scheduled for July 11th. So I was hoping to make that a subcommittee meeting and that we just make that a working committee meeting and then we have a committee meeting in August. For August, receive input, continue to receive input from stakeholders on any draft that we may come up with, readjust the proposal as needed if necessary, and then provide proposal development status update to the full council. It looks like August will be the next council meeting, since a council meeting in July doesn't make a lot of sense because we really don't have a lot to share at this point. Next slide, please. September through November, continue drafting the proposal, including identifying funding needs and benefits. And we talked a bit about this today. And then finalize the proposal, finalize committee review, and then present that final proposal to the council so that we're ready in December to submit a proposal to the governor.
John, can you go back one slide, I think? So the last sentence on this slide, provide proposal development status update to the full council. I think I'll make a further ask, and it makes it more difficult, I understand, but I'd rather get beyond just status updates to the full council and bring something actionable to them. So maybe there's an element that's being discussed that you can get a thumbs up or thumbs down from the council. I think in past situations where we've had status reports to groups like that, it seems difficult to keep the attention of the council members for those types of things, and they're looking to take action on items rather than just get updated on how far along we are in the discussion. So I would ask the committee and subcommittee to think about it a little bit in those terms as well.
Thank you. Before we go to the last slide, are there any final remarks, Patrick or Tom, that you'd like to make? Yes, Sharon.
Just a question on process and how you envision it. If I heard you right earlier, you indicated, and maybe I heard you wrong, that the subcommittee's work would be a working group, it wouldn't be public, it could involve others.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So what process do you envision for soliciting involvement of others? Is it up to the subcommittee members, or is it up to, you're going to?
I would ask the subcommittee members if they
Okay.
have experts that they would like to bring in to work on this, that they bring those with them.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Paul.
I'm just curious, there's two committees, right? This one and then the Assured Water Supply one.
Yes.
Is there any attempt, are they completely separate, or is there any attempt to meld these to, are the work of the two committees into one sort of overall policy? Or
No, at this point, they're two separate committees. Our focus is outside the AMAs and the INAs.
Thank you.
Paul, if you have a great master vision for combining those two, we would love to hear it.
I'll work on that.
Okay.
But they will come together through the council, right?
Yes, they will.
So just the subcommittee work is separate.
Yes.
So the one place that there may be some overlap, Paul, is we do have some rural groundwater areas that have adopted mandatory adequacy, and we have the non-mandatory adequacy program as well. And there might be some overlap there in both directions to address those programs. Although the Assured Water Supply Committee is really more focused on the AMAs who have that Assured Water Supply program element to it, and the issues we know we're having in those programs with the pause on the housing certificate approvals. So not a lot of closing comments from me, other but thanking you all for being here today, and obviously looking at the schedule Bruce laid out, spending a lot of hours of your life in the near future working on these issues. For those of you who attended the first council meeting where Governor Hobbs laid out our charge, I think you could hear in her comments how important this is to her and for the future of the state. We have a big task in a small amount of time by December. And I really like the short-term, midterm, long-term idea. And as Patrick said, we can come up with a proposal and then you can take some more time maybe to flesh it totally out. I worry that in some of the really acute areas, John talked about Wilcox, for example, that greater pressure will come to bear to do something with the two existing tools, which I think we've heard a discussion of today may not be the greatest tools in the world to meet what we need to address in some of those areas. So hopefully we find something that works better in those areas and we can get done by December and address those really acute areas in the near term. And maybe in some of the less acute areas, we have time to do maybe the bigger or more comprehensive discussions of proposals that might work better there.
Thanks, Tom. I would just follow up with that. And again, harken back to John's portion of the presentation. There is a need for action and there is a need for protection of our groundwater resources in this state. And the charge of the committee is to develop recommendations to the governor for groundwater management proposals to achieve that. And we are open to recommendations for executive action, short-term opportunities, or a new proposal or something that builds on things we've already seen. And so we're really looking forward to this committee putting your heads together and coming up with that package that we think is the right path forward for addressing our issues on groundwater in rural Arizona.
Thank you, Patrick. If we could go to the next slide, here's kind of the next steps and somewhat of the homework assignment. But next Rural Groundwater Committee meeting was July 11th. We'd like to convert that meeting to a working subcommittee meeting. Action items for the July 11th meeting, just further review of the starting point proposal as a basis to structure a rural groundwater management program. But we've had a lot of that discussion here today, and that's been very, very appreciative. Be prepared to discuss some of your concepts. What we've heard here, we will put together a much more detailed working agenda by July 6th for this upcoming July 11th meeting. I'm thinking the subcommittee will probably be made up of most of these committee members, but I know we're asking for a lot from you. So if you have a proxy or someone that you think would be very, very effective in working together on this subcommittee, please let us know that too. Yes, Representative Travers.
Just one final comment at the risk of alienating myself as the mouthiest person on the council for the next 4 months. I just very humbly ask that we keep in mind why we're doing this. I have 2 children, 5 and 9, and I want them to have a secure water future. I want everybody's children and grandchildren to have a secure water future. I want to make sure that all our industries thrive, whether they're Intel in Chandler or whether they're agriculture in Yuma, that the goal for all of us working together is to try to solve this problem without necessarily trying to alienate or ruin or destroy anybody's anything. We have an incredible history since we were a territory of farming, and we have this optimistic future of innovation and business and industry. And so, my request to all of you who mostly I don't know, is that we're all coming here, we've all been asked here, and we're all coming here together in good faith to try to solve this problem. So, all I ask is just, let's assume that every single one of us is here for our better angels, and we're trying to support the governor in her goal in trying to secure a future for every Arizonan from all four corners of the state. And with that, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Travers. I don't think I could have said it any better. Thank you. Last slide. Here's contact information. Myself, John Riggins, and Trent. You'll be hearing back from us, of course, with a more detailed agenda, and please let us know if you're going to participate in the subcommittee or who may be participating in your place by July 6th. Stephanie.
So clarifying on the subcommittee and the schedule, so is the intent that the subcommittee is just gonna basically be meeting in July to grind through some of the details? And then this committee will continue to meet through September, November, or is it a parallel process of both the subcommittee and the committee?
I think it's going to be more of a parallel process, but the committee won't meet again until August. With that, we'll conclude today's meeting. Thank you, everyone.